Hi, my name is Marco Beiser, and I'm a Croatian-American composer, and I recently heard the piece Andromeda by Lelek for the 2026 Eurovision contest as the song from Croatia, and I was just blown away by the lyrics, the message, the music, all of it. I'm obsessed, and the last few days I've been sick, and just so I've been watching a lot of these reaction and analysis videos, and it's been really interesting to hear about some of the singers and vocal coaches talk about like the physiology of the singing. But I kind of have another perspective, being Croatian American and a composer. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the historical context of the piece and the lyrics and some of the music theory, which is really cool. History. This first little bit is like not directly relevant, but Balkan history is really fascinating and something that not a lot of people know about. And this is my video and not yours. So we're going to take a time machine back to the Roman Empire just briefly. So we're in the 300s. Emperor Diocletian is in power, and you can still visit his palace in the heart of the city of Split in Croatia. And he was like, "Oh, my empire is just too big. What a headache. I just can't. I need some more R&R." So he decides to split the Roman Empire into two. The Western Roman Empire is based out of Rome, and then the Eastern Roman Empire is based out of Constantinople. And on its face, this was just like, a straightforward little low-key reorg, whatever. Little did he know that this dividing line, which was around the Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia area, would really be a divide that would linger in some form, shifting borders slightly for the next 2 millennia. Winston Churchill in 1946 famously said, "There descends an iron curtain from Steppin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic upon our continent." But in reality, there's been some kind of curtain made of some kind of material there since the Roman Empire. There was the migration of the Slavs. The Slavs came starting in around the 7th century, so up to the foot of the Alps. Much of the Balkans were culturally and linguistically Slavic. Then there was the schism in 1054, in which Serbia and the kind of Eastern Balkans became Orthodox, while Croatia and Slovenia remained Catholic. Then there was the Ottoman occupation of the Balkans, which was probably the most consequential thing to happen to the Balkans in the last 1,000 years. So, in 1389, the Ottoman Empire defeats Serbia and its allies in the Battle of the Kosovo Plains, and over the next few centuries, the Ottomans conquer Constantinople, eventually Budapest, and are at the gates of Vienna before the King of Poland and his allies step in like last minute. Very Ride of the Rohirrim at the third day at Helm's Deep, leads the largest cavalry charge in history, sends the Ottomans packing. But most of the Balkan area is under Ottoman occupation for 400 years, particularly Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, parts of Croatia. And there are definitely some good things I would say, positive cultural imports from the Ottoman Empire. The food, if you've been to the Balkans, you probably had some burek, which is like a cheesy pastry. Absolutely delicious. I live off of it when I'm over there. Also, a lot of the modern pop music has a lot of Turkish influence, which I think is really, really cool. Overwhelmingly, though, the kind of net impact of Ottoman occupation of the Balkans was pretty disastrous. On a geopolitical level, the Ottoman Empire was very slow to adopt the printing press, partially because the printing press wasn't conducive to Arabic script, which is what the Ottoman Empire was using. And much of the Balkans were using the Cyrillic alphabet anyway. So a lot of the Balkans were basically stuck in the Dark Ages. The Renaissance and Enlightenment, just kind of passed it over completely. And if you look at the maps of the literacy rates in Yugoslavia, right at the beginning after World War I, is basically a perfect match in terms of how long those lands were held by the Ottoman Empire. Basically, the longer that an area was under Ottoman occupation, the lower the literacy rate was when all was said and done and the Ottoman Empire fell. And even though so much has happened in the last, 150 years, when you look at a GDP map of Europe today, there's a pretty strong correlation in terms of the countries that were under the Ottoman occupation the longest, like Macedonia, Kosovo, Albania, Serbia, Bosnia, are still economically the most behind when compared to countries that were not under Ottoman occupation as long, or like in the case of Slovenia, ever. So for countries like Croatia, which weren't totally occupied, they were basically for a long time kind of the official like territorial bulwark of the Austrian Empire to hold back the Ottomans. So they were kind of like on and off at war with the Ottomans for like centuries. And of course, a nation can't thrive when it's in perpetual war. But nevertheless, they were still better off than some of their easterly neighbors, and this divide is still really apparent today. And for those people on a personal, on a more individual level, for the people living under Ottoman rule, it was rough. They couldn't own any property. They couldn't own horses. A lot of their churches were torn down. The Ottoman Empire, the army would regularly pillage the town, rape the women, take the children. The girls were sent off to harems. The boys were sent off into the Janissary system, where there would basically be brainwashed soldiers for the Ottoman army. And so here's where we finally get to the song. So there are parts of Bosnia that are predominantly Croat ethnically, and in those areas, as well as Dalmatia, which is basically southern Croatia, and yes, that is where Dalmatians come from. In those areas, the women would often tattoo their children on their arms, on their faces, on their backs, with this mixture of ash, honey, charcoal, and breast milk. Mostly the girls, but sometimes the boys too. And these were a mixture of kind of started off as pagan symbols, but then sort of Christian symbols became intermixed into that. They were sort of used interchangeably. And this practice was called sitsanje, which sort of means like pricking. And the reason for this was that Muslims considered tattoos to be impure, thus meaning that tattooed children could, in their minds, physically, literally could not be converted because they were impure and were also like less desirable sexually because of those impurities. So these tattoos were to protect their children so that they wouldn't get, sold, converted, and sold, turned into sex slaves. How much that was effective, it's hard to say. People can be pretty awful. But, it was kind of like, and if it came to it, they would be killed instead, which is a better fate than the alternative. So pretty heavy stuff. Not good times. So that's what all of those tattoos are. I see a lot of comments here and there calling them henna, which is not quite right. Henna is more, I think, usually, first of all, in Indian culture, and is more celebratory and non-permanent, whereas these are very much permanent and very not celebratory. So that's a little bit of the historical context, and I think this really carries through, especially in the official music video. There's a few videos on YouTube from their performance in Dora in the semifinal and the official music video. I think the official music video really tells that story, so I would really recommend watching that if you haven't already. I think it is incredibly powerful. Also, the title of the song. So Andromeda in Greek mythology, her mother, Cassiopeia, was like, "Oh, my daughter is so beautiful. She's even more beautiful than the sea nymphs." And the sea nymphs were like, "Excuse me?" And they asked Poseidon to like take care of this, uppity woman. And Poseidon sends this sea monster to attack and ravage the kingdom. And then apparently the only way for them to get out of it is for Cassiopeia to sacrifice her daughter Andromeda by chaining her to a rock to sacrifice her to the sea monster. So notably, Andromeda herself did nothing wrong besides just being pretty, relatable, and was just kind of minding her own business the whole time. She's just chained to this rock. But at the last second, Perseus swoops in, kills the monster, saves the day. They get married. Eventually, Athena casts Andromeda into the sky as a constellation. So definitely, those themes of unwilling sacrifice are, translate from that Greek myth. So let's talk about the lyrics now. I've done some translation. I'm not like a professional translator, but I've done some translation work with lyrics from Croatian to English. And I have a theory that, particularly when you're looking at something like lyrics, poetry, things like that, more like artistic texts, that unless you're like really good, that it kind of often has to go through three phases, the translation. Like phase one is right, you have the original Croatian, then like that is translated by somebody whose primary language is Croatian and secondary language is English. So they're able to detect and pick up on a lot of those very subtle nuances in Croatian. But a lot of times when they get translated to English, it sounds a bit clunky. The idioms don't quite work. And I feel like that's what a lot of the translations I see online currently, even some of the official ones, it's like they're not wrong, but they just like sound a little like this sounds like, oh, this is clearly translated from another language. It's like they just kind of don't quite work in English. Now, phase three is somebody whose primary language is English, but secondary language is Croatian, who, understand the Croatian and then know about some of those nuances, but are able to put that in a way into English that kind of makes a little more sense. So anyway, here is my translation. As you light a candle, ask your grandmother why she gave birth to her daughters in fear, why so many chose the grave. Our mothers did not suffer the pains of labor to give birth to slaves. Our tears flow like a river. Why must history repeat itself yet again? Our sons are not servants. Do the cries from their cradles not haunt you at night? Take me, O motherland, my soul is yours. To them I am but flesh. Lead me to the stars, far from shattered nests where amid screams our sons are sent off as soldiers. Lead me to the stars, far from their gaze, Andromeda. The scars are carved to the bone, no mother will ever forgive you. On the table of shame lies gold from our necklaces, while you wash your hands with the blood of our wounds. Traitors, traitors, traitors. And then back to the chorus. So, with that context, I think a lot of the lyrics become pretty self-explanatory. The concepts of children being sold as slaves and being taken away from their mothers, except for I think the last few lines could use a little bit more explanation. So specifically referring to, on the table of shame lies gold from our necklaces, while you wash your hands with the blood of our wounds, traitors, which is then repeated several times. The typical word for necklace in Croatian is ogrlica or lancic, but they specifically use the word džerdan, which is a type of necklace that was kind of very traditional, and it was made of these gold ducats, which were often part of a woman's dowry. So I think that what they're saying is when these necklaces are taken off and that gold just becomes gold and not a džerdan, so i.e. renouncing your faith, selling out your heritage, that this is the greatest shame. And back to Balkan history for a moment, when I was talking about in Ottoman occupation how basically life sucked, that was specifically for people who were not of the Muslim faith. All of that could change for somebody if they converted to Islam. They would get all of those rights that they previously did not have, to own property, to own horses, all that type of thing. And in the Ottoman Empire's defense, for their time, they were actually considered one of the more religiously tolerant empires when compared to their contemporaries in Europe and elsewhere, which is maybe less of a defense of the Ottoman Empire and more of an indictment of their contemporaries. But I digress. So a lot of people in Bosnia in particular converted to Islam as a result. And this was partially because neither Catholicism nor Orthodoxy was as established in Bosnia. There was, for a while, a kind of breakaway Christian church in Bosnia, but we think it kind of fell apart. We don't know a ton about it. But needless to say, a lot of people in Bosnia convert to Islam. And, it's kind of hard to blame them, frankly. But I'm also, from the year 2026 without firmly held religious beliefs. But for people who stuck with the old religion, in this case, Catholicism. We're talking about Croats. To them, the people who converted were traitors, which also kind of makes sense. Like you chose to make this huge sacrifice to live life as a, fifth class citizen because of your firmly held beliefs and because you really believed that you would achieve salvation in the afterlife and you wanted to be a good person and this was how you were to do that. And your buddy over there, he converted and now he's the one in cahoots with the Ottoman soldiers, telling them, where the children in the village are and like that are getting sold off to slavery. So it makes sense that they would think of the people who converted as traitors. I mean, it's just one of those things that's just like awful all around. And I would say, as a kind of side note, I think this sense of betrayal and the resulting mistrust from that is really one of the root causes of many of the ethnic tensions in Bosnia that would later explode in the 90s. And I think it's also worth noting that a lot of times the people who live on the borders of the religious territory of their religion are often the most devout and fervent. For like people in, I don't know, just going to throw something out there like France or somewhere, it's kind of easier to take your religion for granted when it's not under immediate and perpetual threat. Whereas Croats, they saw it their obligation, which they didn't necessarily choose, but their obligation nevertheless, to protect Christendom in Europe. And that is something that they would fight and die for across the centuries. So being a Catholic was a huge part of the Croatian identity. And even today, where, all of Europe is becoming less and less religious, it's still a big part of how people see themselves, even if they're not actively practicing their religion. It's kind of like the old joke in, Northern Ireland. A guy asks another guy if he's Catholic or Protestant, and the second guy responds, "Oh, I'm an atheist." And the first guy replies, "Yes, but are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist?" The Balkans are a little bit like that. That's a bit more of that context of those two lines. So, taking everything together, the song is really about, suffering and identity, and particularly the sacrifices that women make in wartime. It's tempting to say, like, oh, Ottoman Empire, like, this was so long ago. Like, why now? Well, yes and no. Here in the US, we had chattel slavery for really a very similar, actually, time frame to the Ottoman occupation of the Balkans. And this is not a like who had it worse contest, not the point of this, but the effects of slavery still resonate in American society today, particularly in the South, just as the effects of Ottoman occupation of the Balkans reverberate through societies today, particularly in places like Bosnia, which is really still struggling to overcome its history. And even regardless, the song is about the suffering of a mother and her children dying or being taken away. And that's not unique to the Balkans. That's happened, you know, everywhere in the world and is frankly still happening. Just within the last 2 months, the US bombed a girls' school in Iran and like 150 girls were killed. And with things going on in Gaza, one of the lines in this song is, "Why must history repeat itself yet again?" And so I think the song is very timely, and that kind of quiet suffering of mothers is something that this is drawing attention to and is something that is still very much around today, whether it's Ottoman occupation or, the many wars in the Balkans that have happened since then or wars that are happening today. The last thing that I want to mention about the lyrics is I think it's really cool the way that they invoke Andromeda because they kind of lean into the double meaning of it, both as invoking her as this person in mythology who was this unwilling sacrifice. Also, the lyrics about take me to the stars, referencing Andromeda, the constellation and slash or galaxy. So that's my analysis of the lyrics and meaning of this song. All right, now taking my historian hat off and putting my composer hat on. So, what this song does really, really well is combine two different musical styles, which is really difficult to do, I will say, as a composer. This is something that both the composer and the singers are doing together, which is really neat. And it's kind of like, one chemist who is carefully measuring out every ingredient and adds them together in this very specific way, in a specific order, at a specific temperature and pressure, and then, you get this amazing thing that happens as a result. Versus another chemist who just like throws everything into a bucket and whatever happens, happens. This is very much the former. So, how did they do that? I think it boils down to three things ultimately. One is the vocal timbre, two is the musical texture, and three is the harmony. So let's do some listening here. So there's a couple different recordings online. There's the original music video, there's the one of them at Dora, which is the Croatian contest, and then there's the semifinal one. I think the music video is in some ways the most powerful visually. We're going to listen to the one at the Dora contest, which is Croatia contest, named after Dora Pejacevic, who is a famous Croatian composer from the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. All right, let's dive in.
Svijeću, pitaj svoju baku, zašto je kćeri rađala u strahu, zašto su mnogi odabrali groblje, nisu naše majke iznjedrile roblje. Okay, so let's talk about their tone. So they are drawing upon this very traditional Balkan way of singing, which is very like forward, can be kind of nasal or brassy. I'm going to show you this video of a Bulgarian traditional choir, which will kind of demonstrate what I'm talking about here. So you can hear it's like, it's quite different than how we'd sing in sort of Western music. In Western music, particularly in art music, they would sing in a style called bel canto, which came from the opera world. And then, modern pop music is basically like classical and jazz and other things kind of eventually mixed to form pop. And this is very different than that. So it's very primal, very like salt of the earth. It's like these people are of the land. And so that's kind of what they're referencing in Andromeda. But what's interesting is that they kind of blend the two together, right? They start in a more typical pop song kind of vocal tone. And then, right, there's that first verse, there's a lead singer, and then the last line of the verse, everybody joins in. It's kind of a call and response there. And in that last line before everybody comes in, you can hear a transition from this more typical pop tone to this more traditional Balkan tone. Let's listen to that little bit again. So yeah, you can hear her kind of go from one end of the spectrum to the other. All right, so I feel like she did a bit more of a sudden transition from the kind of modern tone, and then kind of it was really on the just the last syllable that she kind of shifted to that more
frontal, kind of traditional Balkan tone. Also, at the end of that, they had that krici. That's a very Balkan style of ornamentation. Those little flip ups, or sometimes they do a flip down. So yeah, so those are some of the really cool ways that they're blending this traditional folk style and a kind of um, modern pop style, so that it feels like it's both at the same time, but also a really cool fusion that kind of respects both and is kind of part of both genres. All right, let's carry on. Okay, let's talk about texture now. So texture is the way that various musical lines relate to each other. And so what this is a kind of drone-based polyphony where we have this melody up here, but then we also have this voice down here. And in a lot of Western European music, right, that's kind of how it would have sounded like, where the drone underneath was just one held on note. What makes this more Balkan sounding is that that lower voice has the same rhythm as the upper voice, which is actually, if we think back to that Bulgarian choir, it's the exact same thing. Right? Approximately that. So yeah, that also makes it sound very Balkan, having that drone underneath, but with the melody being homorythmic, meaning that they have the same rhythm. All right, to add to that, there's actually one other thing that they do, which is really cool when we listen to the bass. So, right, we have this melody here. However, on the bass, we have... So that bass moves from E flat, we're in E flat minor, down to D flat. However, in that the drone voices, rather than moving with the bass, they stay on that E flat. So what would kind of make sense would be, right? So that that drone, which has the same note as the bass, would move down with the bass. But they don't. So they're maintaining that drone, and then it's not until the end of the second line that we finally get where then it moves down with the bass. So there's again a kind of like a really cool push and pull between what would kind of make sense from a modern pop song perspective and what makes sense from a traditional Balkan folk song perspective. While we're here, let's talk about harmony now. Those last three notes are what we call parallel fifths. Before we get to that, let's review what a fifth is. So a fifth is an interval, meaning it is a distance between two notes. So if you have a note and the same note, we call that a unison, and then one next in the scale is a second, two notes away is a third, three notes away is called a fourth, and four notes away is called a fifth. When you have two fifths that are next to each other, we call those parallel fifths. So in that time between around the 900s to 1100s, like a lot of music was actually exclusively parallel fifths, like a lot of those old time chants. because we kind of like hadn't invented the other intervals yet in terms of like harmony. So eventually, though, composers were like, oh, parallel fifths, so last century. And then once we get to what we now call the Baroque era, composers like Vivaldi and Bach wrote the music that they wrote, and everyone was like, this slappeth. And then music theorists came along and were like, but why does this slappeth? And they were like, then, okay, if you want to write music that slappeth, like Bach and Vivaldi, you got to follow these rules. And one of the main rules was no parallel fifths. And those rules would kind of carry on until like the late 1800s, when composers like Wagner and later Debussy and Mahler and Strauss would kind of be pushing and stretching them until everything kind of broke apart in the 20th century. But so by having those parallel fifths, it's really evoking kind of one of two things. This sense of like really oldness, from this music from like the 9 to 1100s, and slash or, just kind of like music from a different musical tradition, not, Western art music. So that's another thing that makes this sound, give it that really sort of like primeval, very like, do not cite the deep magic to me, witch, for I was there when it was written, since we're in Catholic land. So yeah, I think that's another really interesting musical choice that they do to evoke this sense of like agelessness. All right. Okay, so something very important there happened musically, and which is why that arrival point felt so epic. So we're going to have to back up here and do a little bit more music theory. So much of our music in Western music is based on, at its core, a major scale, right? And if you take those exact same notes, except start on the sixth note of that scale, you'll get this. And that is our minor scale. That's all the minor scale is. It's just you take the major scale and you start on the sixth note. It's all the same notes though. So the only difference is the like which note is the most important. It's kind of like the hierarchy of the notes is the different thing. And composers were like, ooh, we love this minor scale, which the fancy name for minor scale is the Aeolian mode. All the rage. However, there was one problem with the Aeolian mode, and that is the seventh note. So, in the major scale, and with any scale, every note wants to go somewhere. And that is kind of what gives music this sense of motion. For example, right? That seventh note in the major scale, it wants to resolve back to our home bass note. Apparently, there's an urban legend that is how they used to wake up Mozart. They would do exactly what I just did, and then Mozart would have to get out of his bed and come over and resolve that. I don't know if it's true, but that's the urban legend. So in the minor scale, though, and so what makes that work is that seventh note is just a half step below our home bass note. So it's right next to each other on the piano. So in our minor scale, it is not just a half step below the note. Right, that is a whole step, which is 2 half steps. A half step would be... So composers, they came up with a couple different variations of the minor scale so that they could get that leading tone. So there's the harmonic minor, which enables them to get that chord progression, which they like, because just how certain notes have places they want to go, certain chords have places where they want to go as well. So that scale allowed to get the right chords that they wanted, but they kind of didn't love that kind of interval in there. So they also developed the melodic minor, which kind of smoothed out some of those kinks and enabled them still to get that leading tone, which they really liked. Okay, back to Lelek. So up until this point, we have not had a leading tone. We've only had the flat 7 that is 2 half steps away from our tonic. So we have, in the very beginning, so that's here's our home bass note, and then there's that flat 7, which is a whole step away. If it was a half step away, it would sound like this. But which is not what they wrote. And then similarly later on, so we similarly have the flat 7 and not the leading tone. However, right here, right before this chord, right before we get into the chorus, we finally get our leading tone. We have which leads us to. So that last chord there with that leading tone is like this magnetic pull that is just drawing us to our tonic. And that's what makes that pre-chorus so effective, because we're kind of building and we finally get that like magnetic into that tonic chord. And that's also the first time where the beginning of the phrase of the main voice was on our tonic home bass note, right? Previously in other times, right, here's our tonic home bass note, E flat. The melody started, or it started on the 3rd. Later, started on the 5th. And this time we finally get bum 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 bum. So that's what makes that spot so cool. All right, let's listen to that pre-chorus again. It's just so good. I think the other thing that's really effective about this chorus is the background, right? We have a very low bass, which is not very active. And then we have in the middle, we have their voices, which are kind of a medium level of activity. And then way high above, we have these strings, these violins, which are digga 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 digga. And that's just like really good orchestration, right? 3 different levels of rhythmic activity, and also in 3 very different registers, means that you can hear and process all of them simultaneously. If they're all in the same register, or if they all have a similar level of rhythmic activity, then it just becomes cluttered and everything is kind of fighting with each other. Whereas this, every element of the music gives each other element of the music chance to breathe. Really, really well done. I also really like how when we go back to the verse, right? The verse starts pretty, the verses start pretty quiet, pretty uh low energy, and not in a bad way, but I just mean like, they're quiet, the orchestration is thinner. And that's what you really want in order to have a place to grow. I think a lot of pop music doesn't have these peaks and valleys, which is why it all kind of feel like it sounds the same, right? Whereas this has tall peaks and kind of low valleys in terms of just like the overall energy arc. And that's kind of a concept I think about a lot, and I talk to composition students a lot, is the energy arc of the piece. And the energy is a combination of all of the elements of music: the tempo, the rhythm, the harmonies, the volume, dynamics, the texture. All of those things, can you use all of those tools and levers to either be gaining energy or losing energy. So the fact that this has very clear, there's a very clear sense of where it's going, which makes it, I think, really compelling from a musical narrative perspective. So I've seen a lot of comments on, the various YouTube videos about people saying like, oh, this feels like a movie trailer, or this feels like a fully realized story or a film, or like they're kind of having trouble placing their finger on what it is that makes this different. But this is really what it is. It's that it has, because there are these peaks and valleys, it has a sense of narrative, that you've started one place and that you've gone to a different place throughout the piece. So I think that, and that's also what really makes this feel to me like more elevated in terms of just like the art, which, I love to see. Okay, this key change is electrifying. It is so good. One of the coolest, most effective key changes I have ever seen in my life, I will say. So, what's going on here? Leading up to the key change, we have the traders. We have and then we end up with this cluster chord here, which I'm not exactly sure of the notes, but it's something like that. And I think it's the only time that we actually have more than two notes going on at the same time. Not 100% sure, but it sounds like all five of them have different notes, and that's the only time in this piece that that's happening. So we have this crunchy, very crunchy cluster chord, and that is kind of the other main device that composers can use to generate harmonic tension. So one is through the scale and knowing, which notes want to go where, and which chords want to go where, and then using that knowledge to set up certain expectations that you sometimes deflect and sometimes fulfill. So that's one method, which we've already talked about and how they've done that. And then this one is really just the concept of, dissonance, and then consonants, and kind of resolving dissonance with consonants. So that that cluster chord, that's what we call like a kind of a very dissonant chord where all the notes are kind of right next to each other. It's really kind of new harmonic territory for us in this piece so far. So it's kind of like, where is this going? And it's also in a very powerful word, traders. And then, right, and then we have these kind of big drum beats, and then all of a sudden, boom. So then the singers come in a new key, F minor. We've gone up a whole step from E flat minor to F minor. And that whole step relationship is not uncommon in pop music. It is one of the more common key relationships in key changes. But I think what is done really well about this one also is that for those first few notes, where it's just the voices, that is kind of the first time where the background completely drops out. So there's no synth, there's no like drones, there's no violins. It's just the singers. And now that they're a whole step higher, they're also in a more tense part of their voices. And this is something that, composers have to think about a lot, particularly when writing for instruments. Like you can have the same note being played by a tuba versus being played by a flute. And that note is, in order for them inherently to be playing the same note, that's going to be a very high note for the tuba and a very low note for the flute. And when that same note is being played on a tuba, it's going to be very intense and have a lot of strain to it, versus if a flute is playing that note, it's going to be very, rich, but kind of, cool and aloof in a way. So by putting the whole thing up a whole step, it's going to make all of their voices in this last final chorus sound more tense. And of course, also by taking out the bass for a second, when that bass comes in, it really grounds us in this new key, because it kind of like hits us like a bag of bricks. And then, damn, we are in F minor. Okay, so there's that key change. Okay, so now here in this chorus, right, we have one of the singers has this kind of descant, this sort of that is happening over top the chorus. And those are the kinds of things that you really want to have for a final chorus. You don't want the final chorus to just be like all the other choruses. And some pop songs will have that key change for that final chorus. But that key change that we have in this song was actually at the beginning of the pre-chorus, which is sort of unusual, actually. And that very much plays with the expectations of the energy arc, because there is an expectation is that the energy that the pre-chorus is ramping up to that final chorus. But what is instead happening is that the bridge is kind of ramping us up And then the pre-chorus is really where there's this big jump in energy, and I feel like that was unexpected in a really satisfying way. And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier about, playing with musical expectations and sometimes subverting them and sometimes fulfilling them. And but when the trick is when you're subverting them, it has to be done well. And I mean, ultimately that's a bit subjective, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and this works. Here we have this really coda. Um, and a coda is kind of like this little tag at the end of a song that really ramps up the drums. We're repeating Andromeda. Really cool. So good. And then at the end, we get that high F. Um, so, as you can tell, I am blown away by this song. I think it's super powerful. Having been in Croatia during the wars in the 90s with my family there, I was kind of too young to really remember it, thankfully. But it just, yeah, it's just so good. And musically, I think it's really, really, really well done. Um, will it win Eurovision? It's hard to say. It is very different than I feel like the typical kind of Eurovision songs are, which are a little bit more kind of like poppy and light, and I think like what makes what makes a lot of pop music what it is by having not too many peaks and valleys, because then it's kind of easy to put that it's kind of easy to DJ that into something. So that's kind of like what a lot of pop music ends up being, is that there's just not a lot of drama, whereas this has a lot of drama. um, so I think it'll ultimately just depend on what people are looking for. I'm not a Eurovision historian expert by any means, but I hope it wins, and best of luck. Also, in case it wasn't obvious, I'm not like some big YouTube content creator star person. Um, so, I really just made this video because this song was just so cool and there was so much in there that I feel like people aren't getting, particularly in terms of like the history and stuff. So thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like it so that it'll pop up on more people's things and they can learn more about this awesome song. Thanks, everybody.